Welcome, everyone. I'm Creon Butler, and I'm head of the Global Economy and Finance program at Chatham House. As the global economy recovers from the pandemic and the emerging threat from climate change becomes ever more real, policymakers face a complex set of macroeconomic challenges. To discuss these ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit this weekend, I'm very pleased to be joined by Neil Shearing, who is an Associate Fellow at Chatham House and also Chief Economist at Capital Economics. Neil, we've just had the UK budget, which is the main annual fiscal event in the UK, and the Chancellor was able to deploy the benefit of faster than previously expected growth to increase real public spending, but also to reduce the growth in public debt. So we have this sort of high tax, high spend situation. And my question really is, how far do you think this is going to be a general phenomenon, or is the situation we've seen in the UK to some extent unique?
I don't think it is necessarily unique. I think it's been replicated to varying extents in different parts of the global economy, certainly within advanced economies across the G7. I think there are remaining three messages from the budget in the UK. The first was that the OBR, which is the fiscal watchdog in the UK, judges that the economic recovery is going to be fuller than it previously thought. It's reduced its assumption on economic scarring from 3% to 2%. For what it's worth, I think actually even that's probably a bit too conservative. But nonetheless, the economic recovery is fuller. The second thing is fiscal policy is still tightening, actually. And this is true across advanced economies. Fiscal policy is tightening, but because of the benefit of that stronger recovery, the Chancellor has been able to dial back the extent of tightening and the speed at which he's withdrawing support over the coming years. And the third thing I think that is perhaps key and and is true across other countries too, is that I think one of the legacies of the pandemic has been a complete sea change in what the powers that we assign to government, the role of fiscal policy, and also what voters expect. And one way that's manifested itself, as you say, is in a larger and more active state. And the UK budget was perhaps the first example that we have of that. Government spending as a share of GDP, full 2 percentage points of GDP higher now than it was in the 5 years prior to the pandemic. So real evidence that we have a larger state in the UK as a consequence of the pandemic. Things like healthcare spending and social care spending much larger now than was the case before.
Indeed, as you say, this is happening in the UK. We also see it to some extent in other countries as well. Another kind of common concern is around higher inflation, and globally now it seems to be taken as a given, if you like, with central banks bringing forward the time at which they may well raise interest rates, and also at the same time we're seeing governments continue with quite generous fiscal plans, although, as you've said, in the UK, there are nuances around that. So given that, how concerned are you about the inflation risk, in the world generally? And in particular, how far do you think the sort of combination of policies could actually tip us over from a situation in which you have a sort of pickup in inflation and then a return to the normal kind of rates we're used to? Instead of that, a kind of inflation spiral, which then becomes a very difficult thing to control.
Yeah, there's an awful lot to unpack there, but you're right that inflation is, when we speak to clients, it's the biggest issue. And it's the thing that the issue that always comes up. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the very fact that we're talking about inflation as a concern rather than the levels of activity and output as a concern really reflects the speed and the strength of the recovery that we've had so far. So in some senses, and I think, and I'll come on to this, I think there's a valid concern in some countries about inflation, but the fact there is one is testament to the strength of the recovery and the fact that we had this huge injection of policy support, both on the monetary and fiscal side, to get us out of what was, let's not forget, the biggest recession, the deepest recession since since the Second World War. So partly it's a reflection of the strength of the recovery. I think it's also fair to say that different things are happening in different countries, but to a large extent, my judgment is that most of the forces that have pushed up inflation this year are, to borrow the words of Jay Powell, transitory. I don't think energy inflation will continue at its current rate beyond probably the second or third quarter of next year. A lot of the reopening inflation that we're seeing, things like airfares rebounding, I think those will dissipate over the second half of next year too. I think strains in global supply chains, I think they will persist for a bit longer, not least because inventory needs to be rebuilt along those supply chains, and that could be inflationary. But again, if the market's allowed to do its job, I think that should work through. So inflation probably peaks somewhere in the UK over 5% later this year. The Eurozone might be maybe a bit below, but it's not going to be far different. The US is already there. But I think by the time, if we record this in 12 months' time, I suspect that inflation will be lower and will be coming down. So in that sense, it's transitory. But then you raised an important question about what's the medium-term outlook for inflation and what should policymakers do about this. I think there's two things going on here. The first is that Friedman says inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Actually, I think a more accurate reflection is that it's always and everywhere an institutional phenomenon. It's a political choice in some senses, inflation. And the interesting development over the past year has been the shift, particularly in thinking in the US and the Fed, towards embracing moderately higher rates of inflation as a price worth paying to achieve other policy goals. And I think actually there's some sense in that. The sky is not going to fall in if the US has inflation at 3% rather than 2%. Indeed, orthodox economists like Olivia Blanchard have been calling for an inflation target of 4% as recently as a few years ago. So I think it's possible there's a change in thinking in some central banks that lead us to kind of higher medium-term rates of inflation, moderately higher. I think once we get beyond 5%, then the work we've done suggests that the economic costs start to outweigh any benefits of higher inflation. But the US is leading that. Europe is not close to that kind of thinking, particularly the ECB, but also the Bank of England. So that's the first point. The second point is regarding the medium term of outlook for inflation, but what should policymakers do? Well, I think if you take a step back, over the past week, there has been a lot of focus on the timing of the first rate hike in the UK. The Bank of Canada surprised markets earlier this week. The RBA has done the same. The Fed next week is going to be meeting and widely anticipated to start tapering its asset purchases. So lots of focus on the timing of the first measures, but take a step back, given the strength of the recovery, given the nascent inflation pressures, underlying inflation pressures building in some places, particularly the US, does it make sense to have this extraordinary level of monetary support still in place? And I think the answer is probably not. So I would focus less on the timing of the first rate hike, more on the fact that we're at the stage of the recovery now where most of the lost GDP is quite close in most advanced economies to its pre-pandemic level. It makes sense to start withdrawing some of that monetary support, tightening monetary policy gradually. But I think gradually is the key point. And I think interest rates will start to move up, but it will be slow. So lots to unpack there. Short version, inflation will fall next year. Underlying inflation pressures building in several economies, but particularly the US. And in that context, it makes sense to start to move towards a gradually tighter monetary policy position, but the emphasis on moving slowly.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I imagine that's the kind of discussion that they've had among G7 or G20 finance ministers and central bank governors. And certainly if you look at the language from their October meeting, they talk about not removing stimulus too soon, but equally, I think that allows for the kind of adjustments that you've described, sort of calibrated adjustment. But when one looks at what's coming up at the leaders' meeting later this week or over the weekend, the two big issues people are focusing on are, first of all, global health, and secondly, climate change. Now, both of these do matter for the global economy. Global health, because what they'll be looking at will be the speed of the vaccine rollout and also the capability to prevent future pandemics, and then climate change, essentially because I think there's a bigger and bigger recognition over the 12 months that the speed of the low carbon transition is such that it could have, if not short-term implications for monetary and fiscal settings, certainly medium-term implications. So two questions really around that. Firstly, I mean, how far do you think the markets are going to care about what the G20 comes out with in these areas this weekend? But secondly, and particularly on the question of climate change, how big do you think this is going to be for central bank frameworks, but also potentially fiscal frameworks in the medium term? You know, how far are we going to have to rewrite them to take account of the elements of that are coming from this very rapid, increasingly rapid low carbon transition?
Well, I think two things. The first on the health and the climate question. I mean, it absolutely, particularly climate, but also in the wake of the pandemic, health. It is that they are the two big policy challenges, I think, particularly climate. And there has been a noticeable shift, I think, when you speak to market participants, both at investment banks, but also asset managers, about the extent to which they are invested in climate action, both physically and metaphorically. It is on investors' radar in a way that it just wasn't even 5 years ago. So in that sense, the markets will be looking for signals from this weekend. Frankly, I think in the short term, it's still all about inflation and central banks and everything else we've just discussed in terms of moving markets at the short end of the curve in particular. But there has definitely been this perceptible shift in interest. Now, there's a second question about what should policymakers do about it, as you suggest. Now, my sense on this is that, to start off with, we're still finding our way. We're still in the foothills of this. We know the scale of the challenge, policy challenge is huge. Exactly what to do about it and how to sequence it, I think we should admit that there's still an awful lot of thinking to do. But my sense is that most of the responsibility should lie with governments rather than central banks. There's a slight danger, I think, that governments slightly sidetrack the attention of central banks onto things like the makeup of their asset purchases and the extent to which they're green or not, when actually central banks should be given responsibility for price stability and financial stability. That is their remit. Anything else they can do on top of that to help with the climate, then fine, but don't distract them from that. But there's a huge fiscal challenge. Government is going to be central to, if economies are going to get to net zero, if we're going to keep within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, then it has to be led by government, and there's a huge role for fiscal policy. We've got a taste of that in the Treasury document that was published before this week's budget. There's going to be some substantial fiscal costs, but also there's going to be some huge economic benefits from this transition. I think also massive costs if we don't undertake it. So the short answer to your question is, I think it lies primarily with governments rather than with central banks.
And I guess in that context, I guess it's a bit surprising there wasn't more on climate change in the Chancellor's budget, because we really haven't got that much time to lose, given the pace at which the changes need to happen. Neil, well, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think these are issues that are going to run and run, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to look at them again in the future. But many thanks for your comments, and until next time. Thank you.
Thanks.